The night of February 14, 2000, began like many other nights in the Degree household. The home was quiet, with Asha Degree, a 9-year-old girl, peacefully tucked into bed in Shelby, North Carolina. Little did anyone know that by morning, Asha would be gone, and her disappearance would soon become one of the most baffling and haunting cold cases in the history of the state. What seemed to start as an ordinary family night quickly turned into an investigation that would span years, drawing in law enforcement, private investigators, and even the public's attention, all searching for answers. That night, Asha's parents, Harold and Aquila Degree, went to bed as usual, along with their other 2 children. They didn't know that Asha would be the one to disappear, leaving behind only unanswered questions. When Harold woke up the next morning, the 6:30 a.m. routine began as usual. He checked on his children, only to find Asha's bed empty. This was the first sign of something terribly wrong. Asha, always a responsible and well-behaved child, would never leave without telling anyone. Her absence was immediately felt. She was nowhere in the house. After frantically searching, Harold and Aquila called 911, setting off a chain of events that would lead to years of heartache, confusion, and grief. Authorities arrived promptly, and the first instinct was that Asha had run away. Though there were no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone had broken into the house, Asha's sudden disappearance pointed to a desperate attempt to escape something unknown. The investigators began by looking for any trace of her in the surrounding areas. There was no sign of her anywhere. Her absence was complete. But as the hours passed and the daylight grew, something stood out: a backpack. Just a few miles from their home, Asha's purple backpack, containing personal items like pencils, a notebook, and a library book, was found by the roadside. The sight of it lying there alone was as eerie as it was perplexing. Why had Asha left her backpack behind? Was she abducted, or had she left on her own? The questions only deepened, but the answers seemed to be just out of reach. Despite the initial thoughts of a runaway situation, the evidence did not align with this theory. Asha's family was quick to rule out that possibility, as Asha had no history of running away and no apparent reason to leave. She had been happy, had no ongoing issues, and had a close relationship with her parents. The fact that her backpack was discarded just a few miles from home suggested that something else was at play. Had she been forced to leave? Or had someone else forced her to leave? As the hours turned into days, and the investigation progressed, law enforcement scoured the area with no sign of Asha. The small town of Shelby had never seen anything like this before. Everyone was asking the same question: what had happened to Asha Degree? There was no ransom note, no demands, no leads. The police had no physical evidence that Asha had been taken. Investigators began to dig deeper into the Degree family's life, looking for any clues that could help explain why this seemingly normal child had vanished without a trace. Asha's family, particularly her parents, struggled with their emotions. They had lost their child, and no answers came. What they did know was that Asha's disappearance wasn't just an isolated incident, it had to be connected to something greater. Could it be an abduction? Was it someone from within their community? Theories began to spread like wildfire. After several weeks of no leads, a local television station picked up the case, and Asha's disappearance began to make national news. Tips from all over the country started flooding in. Some people thought they had seen Asha in places far beyond North Carolina. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, it became clear that the trail was growing cold. The national media, which had initially provided a sense of hope, began to move on to the next story. But for Asha's family, this was not a story, they lived it every day. They were determined to keep the case alive, but they knew that the longer it went unsolved, the less likely they were to ever see their daughter again. As the months passed, Asha's family received some strange tips. Some people said they had seen Asha, while others claimed to have knowledge of where she was. One report suggested that Asha had been seen at a local shopping center, but when investigators arrived, they found nothing. Another tip led them to a home in a neighboring state, but after an extensive search, it turned out to be a dead end. Despite their efforts, every tip seemed to bring them further from the truth. At the same time, investigators were looking into the people Asha had interacted with before she disappeared. They questioned family members, neighbors, and friends. There were no significant leads from these interviews, but certain things began to stand out. Asha had been a bright, well-adjusted child, and there had been no indications of any problems at school or at home. It was unclear why she had suddenly vanished. Some started to wonder if the culprit could be someone from outside the family, a stranger, a kidnapper, or even a troubled individual with a hidden agenda. But if it was someone from outside, who would have had the knowledge and means to abduct a child from her own home without leaving a trace? The police began to explore every possible avenue, even considering the possibility that Asha had been taken by someone close to her. Investigators focused on anyone who had been in regular contact with Asha, including acquaintances from the school, local neighbors, and even the family's extended network of friends. But even with these leads, the case seemed to be locked in a dead end. One of the more intriguing theories that emerged was the possibility that Asha had been taken by someone who knew her well. The idea that someone close to Asha had either been involved or had knowledge of her disappearance seemed to resonate with investigators. There were people who had reportedly seen Asha with certain individuals just before her disappearance. However, when questioned, these people claimed to have no knowledge of anything unusual or suspicious. A breakthrough came when investigators revisited the theory of abduction. They learned that Asha had been seen walking down a nearby street in the early hours of the morning, just hours before her backpack was found. The sighting came from a reliable source, but it was still unclear whether Asha had been walking voluntarily or was being coerced by someone. A passerby had reported seeing a small child walking alone down the street, but when they approached, the child quickly disappeared into the darkness. Was this Asha? Was she walking by choice, or was she being taken? Despite a renewed focus on the abduction theory, there was still no direct evidence linking anyone to the crime. The case continued to bewilder the police and the public. It wasn't until several years later, when forensic technology advanced, that there was a glimmer of hope that something new could be uncovered. But for now, the mystery remained unsolved, and Asha Degree's disappearance became one of the most haunting cold cases in North Carolina's history. Days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, but Asha Degree's disappearance remained an enigma. The investigation, which had initially surged with energy, began to feel like a haunting riddle with no answer in sight. With the passage of time, the trail grew colder. The tips, while numerous, were often vague and unsubstantiated, leaving the investigators grasping at thin air. Despite the police's best efforts, every lead seemed to circle back to the same disturbing truth: Asha was simply gone, with no sign of where she had gone or why. As time wore on, the Degree family's initial hopes began to fade into despair. Every night, they went to bed thinking of their daughter, praying she would return, but each morning they woke up with the harsh realization that she was still missing. For Asha's parents, Harold and Aquila, every moment without their daughter was like an endless, agonizing nightmare. They had no answers, only the endless echo of their daughter's absence. At the same time, the police faced a growing sense of frustration. They were dealing with a case unlike any other they had encountered. The lack of evidence, the absence of any substantial clues, and the growing uncertainty about whether Asha had even been abducted in the first place made the case exceedingly difficult. In the weeks that followed, the authorities began to consider the possibility that Asha's disappearance wasn't simply a case of abduction but could have been something far more complex. Was she taken by a stranger? Or was there another, more sinister explanation lurking beneath the surface? Investigators went back to the beginning, re-examining every piece of evidence they had gathered. They studied the photos of the house, the search efforts, the last known sightings of Asha, and the timeline of the night she went missing. Despite the thoroughness of their investigation, they were met with more questions than answers. Every door they opened seemed to lead them in a different direction, only to find that the lead was a dead end. One key element that caught the attention of investigators was the fact that Asha's backpack had been found so close to the family home. Why was it discarded there? Why hadn't she taken it with her, especially if she was planning to run away? The location of the backpack raised more questions. It suggested that Asha had been in the area, but why would she leave such an important item behind? If she had left of her own accord, why hadn't she packed her things? Why did she leave her personal belongings behind, including her school bag? As investigators pondered these questions, a disturbing possibility began to take shape. Could Asha have been taken by someone who knew her, someone who could easily convince her to leave the safety of her home? The idea of a familiar abductor, someone from her life, became a focal point for the investigation. It wasn't a new theory, but it gained more traction as investigators scrutinized the people closest to Asha. Family, friends, and neighbors were all questioned, but no concrete evidence linked any of them to the case. Still, the theory that Asha may have been taken by someone familiar to her family seemed to make more sense as the investigation continued. The first potential suspect in the case was a man named Michael Mickey Wright, who had been involved in previous child abductions in the area. He was known to be in the vicinity of Shelby around the time Asha disappeared. Wright's criminal background, coupled with the fact that he was nearby, led investigators to believe that he might be involved in Asha's case. However, after questioning and further investigation, authorities were unable to find any conclusive evidence linking Wright to Asha's disappearance. Despite his previous criminal activity, Wright was eventually ruled out as a suspect, and investigators moved on to consider other leads. As time passed, the case began to take on a more speculative tone. Theories started to emerge, but none of them were concrete enough to lead to a breakthrough. Some believed that Asha had been abducted by a stranger, someone who had been watching the family. Others thought she might have been kidnapped by someone she knew, a person who had carefully planned the abduction, knowing exactly what to do to avoid detection. The possibility of a stranger abduction seemed unlikely, especially considering the lack of evidence and the fact that Asha had been missing for so long without a ransom demand. But the idea that someone in the community had been involved couldn't be ruled out entirely. Meanwhile, the Degree family was doing everything they could to keep their daughter's case in the public eye. They appeared on television, speaking out about Asha's disappearance, urging the public to come forward with any information. But despite their pleas, no one came forward with anything that could help solve the case. The public interest in the case, which had been high in the beginning, started to wane as time went on. Asha's case began to fade from the news cycle, and the town of Shelby tried to move on. But for Asha's family, there was no moving on. They couldn't stop thinking about their daughter, and they couldn't stop searching for answers. The passing of time brought a sense of hopelessness to the case. With each passing year, the chances of finding Asha alive seemed to diminish. The case became colder and colder, and the likelihood of solving it seemed less and less probable. But Asha's family refused to give up. They kept searching, kept hoping, and kept believing that one day, someone would come forward with the information that would lead them to their daughter. Years passed, and the case continued to frustrate investigators and the Degree family alike. There were new leads here and there, but nothing that could be definitively linked to Asha's case. Investigators explored every angle, from Asha's possible involvement with a stranger to the possibility that she had run away. But the evidence was thin, and nothing concrete ever emerged. Despite the many theories and leads, Asha's disappearance remained an unsolved mystery. Over time, it became clear that the case would not be solved easily. But Asha's family refused to accept that their daughter was simply gone. They continued their search, believing that one day, they would find the truth. As the years went by, the memory of Asha Degree's disappearance never faded. It haunted her family and the town of Shelby, and it became a part of the fabric of the community. The questions remained, and the mystery persisted. Where had Asha gone? Why did she disappear? And who was responsible? The unanswered questions continued to weigh heavily on the minds of everyone who had been involved in the case. The mystery of Asha Degree's disappearance was not just a cold case, it was a painful reminder of the unknown, a haunting puzzle that remained unsolved. And as the years turned into decades, it seemed that the answers would never come. Despite the passage of time, Asha's family never gave up hope. They kept pushing for answers, hoping that one day, they would find the truth. But the deeper the investigation went, the more questions arose. Theories about Asha's disappearance continued to multiply, but the truth remained elusive. Was she taken by a stranger, or did she leave of her own volition? Could someone from the community have been involved, or was it the result of a random act? As the years wore on, the case seemed to grow colder and colder, but Asha's family refused to let go of the search for their daughter. As the months passed without any major breakthroughs, the investigation into Asha Degree's disappearance began to feel like an insurmountable puzzle. Each lead seemed to fade into nothingness, leaving investigators and the Degree family grasping at straws. Yet, despite the passage of time, the case was not forgotten. The community in Shelby continued to hold on to the hope that one day, Asha would be found and brought back home. Her family refused to accept that their daughter was simply gone, and they clung to the belief that someone, somewhere, knew something that could lead to answers. The case had a profound impact on the small town of Shelby. The disappearance of a 9-year-old child shook the entire community to its core. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had heard Asha's story all tried to help in any way they could. But as the investigation wore on, the frustration grew. There were no signs of Asha, no confirmed sightings, and no credible leads. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving only the haunting question of why. Despite the dwindling public attention, the Degree family did everything they could to keep the search alive. They kept talking to the media, reaching out to anyone who might have information. They distributed flyers with Asha's picture, hoping that someone would remember something, anything, that could shed light on the case. They even enlisted the help of private investigators, hoping that fresh eyes on the case could bring a breakthrough. As the years passed, the investigation turned to more unconventional methods. Investigators began to look at the psychological angle, questioning whether Asha's disappearance could have been related to an emotional breakdown. Some speculated that Asha might have been experiencing personal struggles that led her to run away, perhaps as a result of stress or conflict at home. But there were no signs of this. Asha had always been a happy, well-adjusted child. She had no history of emotional issues, and her family life appeared to be stable. The theory that she had run away seemed increasingly unlikely. Then, new questions began to surface. Could Asha have been the victim of a random abduction? This was a chilling thought, but one that had to be considered. In the years since her disappearance, there had been reports of other children vanishing under similar circumstances. Had Asha been taken by someone who had been following her? Had the abductor been watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Investigators began to turn their attention to the possibility of a serial offender, someone who had a pattern of targeting young girls. This theory, however, would lead them down yet another confusing path. Despite numerous leads and countless hours of investigation, there was still no evidence linking anyone to Asha's case. In the years following Asha's disappearance, the case remained open but stagnant. The evidence was sparse, and the lack of new information made it difficult for investigators to make progress. Theories continued to swirl, but without solid leads, they remained just that, speculation. Asha's family, however, refused to give up. They continued to search for their daughter, even when it seemed like all hope was lost. It wasn't until 2004 that a significant new lead emerged. A tip from a local resident claimed to have seen a young girl matching Asha's description in a nearby town, just a few miles from Shelby. The person who came forward had seen the girl in the back of a car, being driven away by an older man. The tip was vague, but it was enough to reignite the investigation. Police followed up on the lead, interviewing witnesses and attempting to trace the car seen in the area. But, as with so many other leads, this one too came to a dead end. The car couldn't be identified, and the young girl seen in the backseat was never conclusively identified as Asha. The search continued, but the trail remained cold. Over the years, Asha's case became one of the most well-known unsolved disappearances in North Carolina. It was a case that tugged at the hearts of many, not just because of the chilling circumstances of Asha's disappearance, but because of the unanswered questions that continued to haunt the investigation. What had happened to this little girl? Had she been abducted? Was she still alive? Or had something even darker happened to her? By the time 2011 rolled around, a decade had passed since Asha Degree's disappearance. The case was still open, but as each year went by, it seemed less and less likely that anyone would ever come forward with the key to solving the mystery. However, in that same year, a significant shift occurred. New forensic methods and advances in DNA analysis were beginning to offer investigators new hope. Could DNA technology finally provide the breakthrough the case so desperately needed? DNA analysis had played a significant role in solving many cold cases across the country, and now, it was being applied to Asha's case. Investigators began to go back over the evidence that had been collected over the years, including hair samples, fibers, and other physical evidence that had been found at the scene. With the advancement of DNA testing techniques, there was a renewed sense of optimism. Could this be the key to solving the case? Could DNA analysis finally unlock the mystery of what happened to Asha Degree? In the meantime, the Degree family continued their search, growing more desperate with each passing year. They held vigils, spoke to the media, and kept Asha's face in the public eye. They refused to let her be forgotten. Their love for Asha never wavered, and they held on to the hope that one day, they would finally get the answers they so desperately needed. Despite the renewed efforts, the case still remained unsolved. However, as new leads and fresh evidence continued to be discovered, there was still hope. The case was far from over, and Asha's family knew that they could never give up. In the years following, as technology continued to advance, investigators began to uncover more and more potential leads. Some led to false hopes, while others opened up new avenues of investigation. But still, the most important question remained unanswered: where was Asha Degree, and what had really happened to her? As the years passed, the case of Asha Degree continued to haunt her family and the Shelby community. The unanswered questions, where was Asha? What happened that night? Lingered in the minds of investigators, family members, and everyone who had followed the case. Despite the passage of time and the increasingly cold nature of the investigation, the Degree family refused to give up. Their determination remained unwavering, as they continued to hold on to the belief that Asha was out there somewhere, waiting to be found. But as the years wore on, it became clearer that the answer would not come easily. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the lack of physical evidence. Asha's disappearance, though mysterious from the very beginning, seemed to lack the typical clues that would lead to a breakthrough. No fingerprints, no forensic evidence, no clear signs of a struggle. The absence of concrete evidence made the case difficult to crack. The search efforts were extensive, but no tangible leads had surfaced. The missing backpack was the only major clue, and it seemed so out of place. Why would a child take off in the middle of the night without her personal items? Why leave behind the very thing she would need on such a long journey? This anomaly puzzled investigators, and it continued to be a focal point of the case. In 2014, a new development provided a glimmer of hope. A breakthrough in DNA testing led to a new round of analysis on the case. The Department of Justice, in collaboration with forensic scientists, began applying new techniques to the old evidence. The idea was to re-examine the materials collected from Asha's room, the house, and the surrounding areas, hoping that new technology could help identify clues that had been overlooked in the past. Perhaps DNA found in the area where Asha's backpack had been discarded could shed light on the mystery. Perhaps new forensic methods could help track down the last person to see Asha. It was a long shot, but the investigation was revived with a renewed sense of hope. While this was a step forward, it also exposed a sobering reality. Despite the advances in forensic science, Asha's case had grown colder over the years. Theories and leads continued to surface, but there were still no solid connections to the family's missing child. The investigation was becoming more like an open-ended riddle, with pieces scattered across time, and no clear picture emerging. Some even began to speculate that Asha's disappearance might have been linked to a more complex conspiracy, with darker forces at work. This theory gained traction in some circles, where the unexplained nature of her vanishing seemed to hint at something more sinister. But with no concrete evidence to support this, it remained one of many ideas without resolution. In 2016, another significant lead came in the form of an anonymous tip. A person who claimed to have known Asha's whereabouts came forward, stating that they had seen her in a nearby town shortly after her disappearance. The tip was vague but intriguing. The person reported seeing Asha with a man who had been driving a car through the area, claiming that the child was alive and being held by this individual. While law enforcement followed up on this tip, it quickly proved to be another false lead. The person who provided the information could not be tracked down, and no evidence surfaced that could support this claim. This, unfortunately, was another instance of false hope for the Degree family, who continued to wait for the truth to be revealed. By 2017, the search for Asha Degree had become more of a national issue. News outlets had picked up the story again, and the case was being featured on true crime documentaries, podcasts, and investigative shows. The national spotlight brought new attention to the case, but it also fueled speculation. Theories ranged from the idea that Asha had been abducted by a stranger, to the suggestion that she may have been coerced into leaving by someone she knew. Several individuals who had previously been considered suspects were now back in the spotlight, their connections to the case being re-examined. One suspect, a man named Kenneth, had been a longtime acquaintance of the Degree family. He had been questioned during the early stages of the investigation, but no evidence had linked him to Asha's disappearance. However, as the case gained new attention, Kenneth's background began to raise more questions. Some investigators began to suspect that he may have known more than he had let on. His history of criminal activity and his proximity to the family made him a person of interest once again. But once more, investigators found no concrete evidence to tie him to the case. In 2018, a significant development brought the case back into the public eye when a fresh wave of interviews with witnesses led to the possibility of a suspect being identified. Several individuals who lived near the Degree family's home reported hearing strange noises or seeing a vehicle near the house on the night of Asha's disappearance. These witnesses couldn't identify the vehicle or person involved, but their testimony added a new layer of intrigue to the investigation. Could this be the break investigators had been waiting for? Or was it just another dead end? As the investigation grew colder, the Degree family continued to hold out hope. Despite all the failed leads, they couldn't stop searching. They continued to distribute flyers, meet with investigators, and advocate for their daughter in the public eye. The case may have been losing steam, but the Degree family's determination never wavered. Every year, on the anniversary of Asha's disappearance, the family would hold a vigil in Shelby, hoping that someone, somewhere, would come forward with the missing piece of the puzzle. In 2020, the case took another unexpected turn when a journalist from a local news outlet uncovered a possible link between Asha's case and another unsolved disappearance in the state. The similarities between the two cases were uncanny. Both involved young girls who had vanished without a trace, both had been living in small rural towns, and both had seemingly vanished in the dead of night. Investigators began looking into this new lead, hoping that there could be a connection between the two cases. While no definitive links were found, this revelation stirred up the investigation once again, prompting a re-examination of old theories. Now, as of 2022, the case remains open, but there is no clear resolution in sight. Investigators have promised to keep searching, and Asha's family continues to fight for answers. The mystery of her disappearance is far from over, and while the public's interest has waned in recent years, the Degree family has made it clear that they will not stop until they find out what happened to their daughter. The questions that still linger after all these years are as haunting as they are unresolved. Was Asha Degree abducted by a stranger, or did someone close to her have something to do with her disappearance? Could she still be alive, somewhere, waiting to be found? What happened to this innocent young girl, and why was she taken from her family in such a mysterious, unsettling way?